All right, thanks, Scott Shannon. Glad you're with us. Final hour, Sean Hannity Show. Toll free if you want to join us this hour. It's 800-941-SEAN if you want to be a part of the program. Now, I've been warning about the media, and they're falling into line. They're chasing rabbits. Whatever the White House story is of the day, they're going to go out there and chase it. Now, the president did that with Gitmo, and the president's out there in Oklahoma, and he's hugging Chris Christie, and they're throwing footballs. By the way, staying away from the area where the most damage still exists in New York and in Staten Island and in Long Beach and in all these other places where they're the Rockaways, where they have not made a lot of progress after Hurricane Sandy. But anyway, I digress here. The one thing that we've got to pay attention to is now we have two soldiers that have been targeted for death. We showed the video both last night and last week about what happened in England. Now we got another incident in France. And we've got soldiers now being targeted for these terrorist attacks. You got riots moving into their fifth day in Stockholm, and the press there has kind of Obama, Janet Napolitano-itis, and they have an unwillingness to say what this is, and that is using the M-word, Muslim, to describe those involved. It's pretty much nearly been unanimous, as has been pointed out, Newsbusters and a few other places. And they say, well, the youth are rioting, but it's mostly been, according to the reports I'm reading, Muslims rioting, a lot of them. And so we have a problem, not only in Europe, but in this country, just having the ability to just recognize and say that we have Islamic radical terrorists. And we now see that it is happening around the globe, even though I guess the president's narrative has been that he's fixed all of this. On top of that, we've got al-Qaeda in the United States. We can go through a whole list of examples of that. We've got in Pakistan, a senior Taliban militant was killed, and that's a good thing by a drone strike. And then we've got the situation in Syria, North Africa, the Middle East. And John McCain was recently in Syria. But if we help out the rebels that want to go against Assad and remove him from power, do you set yourself up for another Arab Spring, which becomes an Arab winter? All questions we need answered. Anyway, here to go through the one rabbit we ought to be keeping our eye on, which is national security and the rise of radical Islamists in our time, is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. And also joining us is Robin Simcox, is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society in London and co-author of Islamist Terrorism, The British Connections. And Dr. Fahim Yunus is the founder of MuslimAmerica.com, a website, former president of a national Muslim youth organization. Dr. Yunus, I'll start with you. Do you think that I am correct in saying that we are living through a time that we can only describe as the rise of the radical extremists, radical Islamic extremists?
Sean, thank you very much for having me on, first of all. I completely agree there's a tumor within the body of Islam. What I mean by that is when 90% of Indonesia, that is the most populous Muslim country in the globe, on the world, when 90% of them believe that their version of Islam has a positive influence in politics, there goes your separation of church and state. When more than 50% of Muslims in Pakistan, which is the second most populous Muslim country, they believe anybody doing any act of blasphemy should be killed, then, we have serious issues with freedom of speech and expression. But my feeling is what is more important here, as a member of Ahmadiyya Muslim community, the oldest Muslim organization in America, Sean, what we have been saying over and over again, that when you have to go after a tumor, Dr. Jasser is on the show, he will agree with this, that you want to make sure that you just hit the tumor cells. You don't hit the whole body, because the more collateral damage there is, the more you lose. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
But the problem isn't the numbers, like even, for example, name me a country that lives under Sharia law where there is not oppression of women, minorities, the way apostates are treated if they want to change their faith, or the way Coptic Christians in Egypt, for example.
See, I completely agree with that granular detail that you're throwing out. Women rights, apostasy, the ideology of violent jihad, the ideology of killing for blasphemy, loyalty to the country that you live in. Those are exactly issues that we as members of Ahmadiyya Muslim community want to engage the Muslim world. But the problem is, the moment you say Sharia is a very broad term. It's just like saying the weather is bad. there's a lot of collateral damage with that term, Sean, because the moment...
Well, tell me what version of Sharia, what example of Sharia that is implemented that is not guilty of these things?
No. See, when I give 2.5% of my money as charities for the poor, I'm acting on Sharia.
No, but I'm not talking about, I'm talking about the oppression of women. I'm talking about the treatment of apostates. I'm talking about the unwillingness to allow others to freely choose the religion of their faith.
I'm 100% in agreement with you. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's just semantics. The words are
it's not semantics because in all practicality, I'm asking you to give me an example where these are not problems where Sharia is practiced.
Right, and I will agree with that. I will agree with that wholeheartedly. That's the reason there are more than 5 million Muslims here in America, because they prefer separation of church and state no matter what they say. And I always joke with my friends, hey, if you really want to live under Sharia law,
well then hang on a second.
Then why to Saudi Arabia?
Then why is it that we have in certain European countries the desire for Sharia courts? There have even been calls in this country to have separate Sharia courts.
It is because they don't have spiritual leadership, Sean. It is because there are 100 people in the bus, but they don't know where to go with that. Yeah. Because their leadership is corrupt, they're getting Saudi petrodollars, and they have a political agenda rather than a spiritual agenda. And that is why the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, we keep repeating that we have a spiritual leadership. We are those 5 people in that bus who have the map, who can help these 100 people get where they want to go. Otherwise, this ideology of a political Islam is self-destructive for Islam itself.
All right, Dr. Jasser.
Sean, I have to say, he goes the first step right, but the problem is the reason your questions are so on point is that there's been no solutions offered. And the problem is when you have a killing like happened in London and then in France, and we had the National Guard arrests, shootings, we had the Fort Hood, on and on. The military is a target because this is a conflict of nationalism. There's Islamo-nationalism, and then there's American nationalism. And these nationalists are in conflict. And until we have a movement of Muslims to counter that movement for Sharia states, for Islamic states and political Islam, we're not going to find a solution. Muslims are going to be, even though they're silent, are part of the problem. That's the problem with what my colleague was just saying, is that he says the right things, yet you're looking for those movements of Muslims that are solving the issues. And that's what I talk about in my book, The Battle for the Soul of Islam, is that too many Muslims are silent. We're not speaking out about the need to be pro-American and pro-American foreign policy and anti-Islamist. And it's just been too silent, and there are not enough movements. And we have to start to say, you know what, this is happening on our watch. Not all Muslims are Islamists, but all Islamists are Muslims. And we need to fight this, and it's just been too quiet.
All right, so what do you think, Robin Simcox?
Well, I mean, we've had to deal with this problem very viscerally in the United Kingdom, where there actually has been things like Sharia courts established with the government's knowledge. And the problem of the crux of this is that in the UK we make all sorts of allowances for differences of interpretation, difference of thought, freedom of speech. But unfortunately, the problem has been that some of these extreme sentiments have ultimately resulted in terrorist acts, and obviously most graphically in the streets of Woolwich last week. And that's what the UK government, not just this year, but for many years, has been trying to work out the most efficient response to it. And the bad news is that it still hasn't been done yet.
Yeah, well, I guess it all comes down to what percentages are we talking about that buy into the radical Islamic thought, because from my perspective, it's much greater than we would have people believe. I mean, if you look at some of the recent polls that have come out and the views of those that, for example, in Egypt, the people that want Sharia as their governing model and people's views on apostates and all of these things, it seems that the overwhelming majority of people, Dr. Jasser, buy into a pretty extreme, radicalized view of Islam.
You are exactly right when it comes to the leadership. However, if we believe that that's the majority of Muslims, we're basically saying there's no solution except either converting a quarter of the world's population or somehow building a wall around ourselves in this planet where it's impossible, where they infiltrate Boston, they infiltrate our mosques and other places. So what we have to resign ourselves to as Muslims and as Americans to say it's time to build a consensus that we will counter political Islam the way we did communism in the Cold War, begin to build a consensus that we have to find those allies. The mayor of London said just 2 days ago, Islamism is a virus that needs to be countered, and we have not been countering it. They've been appeasing and coddling political Islam, and they've not been able to separate who our allies are from our enemies. And it's time to build that consensus, and we've not done it because we're cowards, and we've not had the leadership in the West and also within our Muslim communities that have done so.
Well, what do you think about that, Robin?
I would agree, and I would say that to go one step further, certainly in the UK, we've not only coddled some of those people, we've actually been paying them. We've engaged only with the extremists because it's the extremist mindset we've been so keen to understand. However, what that's done has meant that the Muslims and the majority of the Muslims in the UK who have always been democratic, never supported extremism or terrorism, have been exactly the ones who've been left out of the conversation. We've done a uniquely bad thing in that we seem to have only engaged with those who oppose the British government, oppose the West more broadly, and our allies and the moderates we seem to have entirely shunned. We've got it exactly the wrong way round in the UK, and I would suggest also begin to getting it wrong in the US as well.
Yeah. Well, what do you know, Mr. Yunus, I guess what we're looking at here is that, from my perspective, is that, and I'm interested in all of your comments because you are all acknowledging basically the same thing, that there is a problem, sure, that there is timidity. There's a lot of people seem to be walking on eggshells and identifying radical Islamic terrorists, including our own president and our own Homeland Security Secretary. We know that Mr. Simcox here he's describing the same thing going on in England, and I can tell you it's happening in France and in Belgium and in other European countries. And there's this fear. There is this intimidation factor, and that is that those that are watching their religion being hijacked by people that would sooner put bombs on their own kids and send them to go blow up innocent people in the name of Allah with a dream of 72 virgins, they don't get confronted. They don't seem to get pushed out. There does not seem to be a loud consensus among moderate Muslims, those that believe in freely practicing one's faith and have good hearts and good intentions. They don't seem to want to speak out.
Exactly. And then, Sean, I would suggest, and I agree with Dr. Jasser there, any time when an atrocity like Boston happens, what I would like to see all Muslim groups coming in Boston within 3 days of that atrocity and really telling America, where do they stand on the ideology of violent jihad? Do they consider this jihad? Is there an and, if, or a but? Anytime there is something happens against a Coptic Christian in Egypt, we need to stand right here in New York and talk about the rights of minority. Anytime a person or a pastor is killed in Iran because of converting to another faith, we need to call out the Muslim community and say, where do you stand on the apostasy issues? But at the same time, Sean, my issue really is that if we all start treating 1 billion Muslims around the world as our enemies, guess what?
I didn't say that 1 billion Muslims are our enemies. I said those that have hijacked their religion, and it seems, and there seems that the numbers are more numerous than I think other people have estimated in the past, as evidenced by polls that have come out in a country like Egypt, for example, more recently, and other Muslim countries that have done polling. And the other scary thing is moderates that are watching their own religion being hijacked and radicalized seem intimidated into silence.
The reason the numbers are more than what you're saying, and the reason they're so large, is we keep focusing just on the violence. And if you just focus on the terrorism, that's the tip of the iceberg. The feeders for terror, where the militants are one part of it, is this concept where the Ummah, the Muslim community, is a state. Is this concept where it's us versus the West, the secular states are godless. And until Muslim imams start to say that the Islamic State is dead and that allegiance should be to our secular states first, 81% of British Muslims said that they're Muslim first and British second. That's the core of the cancer. The cancer is not terrorism. That's simply one symptom. And this is where I differ with my colleague. We need a much more frontal approach to the general, almost normative Islam, which is political.
All right, so Dr. Jasser, let me ask you this. If I say that we're going to look back through the prism of history and we are living through the rise of radical Islamists, how big can that movement possibly get? I mean, we've had battles against fascism and Nazism. I mean, could the radical element in the Muslim world rise to that level? God forbid.
Well, it has risen, Sean. It's not radical. It's the typical Islamist movements that you see current running Iran, running Saudi Arabia, running Egypt, and in many ways influencing to controlling Pakistan and Afghanistan and now Iraq. So you have hundreds of millions of people already controlled by Islamism, but yet the majority of Muslims, I believe, if the liberal Muslims like myself, those that are pious but yet separate mosque and state and are post-enlightenment, that believe in modernity, if we had the support of the West that believed it was time to approach this like a new Cold War, I think you would see a future success.
All right, guys, I appreciate all three of you being on to discuss it now that we've had the second attack now and soldiers are being targeted. And I think the outcrop of what has happened with radical Islamists, I don't think you'll see as many, what some would like on the radical side, spectacular attacks that kill many, many people. I think they're going to be more smaller attacks, targeted attacks, and it's getting a little scary. All right, quick break. We'll come back. Toll free. It's 800-941-SEAN if you want to be a part of the program, and we will continue.